Good afternoon and welcome everybody to the Stony Brook University College of Arts and Sciences preview session. I'm Amanda Mills, Assistant Director of Admissions for Stony Brook, and I have a few notes before we begin. First, please use the Q&A feature to ask our speaker any questions, and we will answer them at the end of the presentation. Second, note that this session is being recorded and will be available on the admissions YouTube page soon. And now please join me in welcoming our presenter, Aurélie Violette, Associate Professor of the Department of Hispanic Language, Literature, and Culture, and the Department of History.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Amanda, for this presentation. And thank you, Amanda and Paula, for this invitation. It's a pleasure for me to be here today, and I hope to interest you in what we are doing at Stony Brook. So I will share my screen because I have a presentation that I would like to share with you. Here it is. So today I will talk about a class that I am teaching this spring, and then I will be teaching in the future as well. That's a course that has to do with disability studies and society. So what do we do in this class? It's a class open to all undergraduate students from freshman year to senior year. It's a class taught in English on the theory of critical disability studies. We also study practical cultural items from the US and also from Europe, and especially from Spain. This is one area I study. I study Spain, so that's why I include it here. Also, because it's really good to compare when you have such an important topic as disability. It's nice to compare countries and see how they address the issue in the law and in society, and also in culture, because culture is, a way to represent what we are in society. So what is considered a disability? When we talk about disability, when we say disability, what is it that we talk about? We use expressions such as disabled person or person with disabilities. That's the first thing that we use. In this class, and I have a comment on the slide, we are aware. I want students to be aware of the vocabulary that they use, that we use in society regarding disability. So we talk about disability, but we talk about diversity as well, which is also another word that is employed to talk, another expression to talk about or to address disability. We also say a person has a disability if this person has a physical or mental impairment. So another word that we use is impairment. So in this class, we address the differences that exist between using one word or another. Is it different if we use disability or if we use impairment or if we use diversity? The answer is yes, but what are these differences? And it's very complex. So we debate a lot, even if it's a large lecture course. Students participate very much because it's an interesting topic and it's a debate. So if you are interested, I'm not going to show the YouTube video because it's a webinar, it's short, but there's this, you can write down this name. Dan Thorpe has a great YouTube video that explains the basics of disability studies and especially critical disability studies, right? Being critical is important. Another thing that we do in society is also using percentage. We say, and especially the law, right? This person has a 50% disability or a 70% or a 30%. But what does disability really encompass, right? In the last few decades, there has been major changes, and not just regarding the term or the vocabulary that we use to refer to people with diverse bodies, but also within the legal approach. So we do that. Let's explore the American Disability Act. Right? This is something that changed America very much. So what is the ADA? So I have to do a new share, I believe, here. So the ADA is the American with Disabilities Act, and it became a law in 1990, right? Quite recently, actually. I mean, the ADA is a civil rights law that prohibits discrimination against individuals with disabilities in all areas of public life, meaning jobs, so the workplace, schools, so education, transportation, and all public and private places that are open to the general public. What is the purpose of this law? It's to make sure that people with disabilities have the same rights and opportunities as everyone else, right? So there's this website about the ADA that I share with students. Sorry, I stopped sharing altogether. Okay, so that is something that we study in this class. So what is the definition of disability that the ADA gives us? So the ADA defines a person with a disability as a person who has a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities. This is a quote from that website. This includes people who have a record of such an impairment, even if they do not currently have a disability. This is extremely important that it came into the law. It also includes individuals who do not have a disability, but are regarded as having a disability. The ADA also makes it unlawful to discriminate against a person based on that person's association with a person with disability. Okay, my slide doesn't change, so wait, my apologies. We'll go to the next one. So I was talking about words and the words that we use right before. So the terminology is important. Why? Because, and this is something we talk a lot in that class and that we debate, we need to consider how we speak about ourselves and our peers, because language conditions the way people are perceived, right? So there are some words that we do not employ anymore to talk about people with disabilities, because we consider these words to not be proper, to not be respectful. And in the past, they might have used them. Now we are aware that they condition people. For example, in the medical field, some words are used such abnormal, atypical, pathological. And this has very much an impact on the people who are defined with those words, right? So the question we ask, does this have an influence on how we perceive people with disabilities? Yes, very much, because words define things, they define people. So we do want to be aware of that in order to change that and to construct an inclusive society. So in the course, we study the difference, for example, between impairment, sensory, physical, cognitive impairment, what we call impairment, and disability, which is a restriction of activity because of contemporary social organization that do not take into account people who have impairment and thus exclude them from participation. I'm going to give you an example of that. So this is, you can see my screen, right? This is a great example of the difference between impairment and disability, right? Because before you have the bagel shack with a stair, and the stair, the existence of the stair creates a disability for someone who has not the possibility of entering a room if there is a stair. Whereas after, if the entrance has a ramp, the entrance is possible for everyone, right? So removing barriers, such as a step to an entrance, is required when readily achievable. That's what they say. So one of the things that, we try to be aware of is that, and in the example, right, if the person who invented the stairs invented a barrier for some people. If we did not have stairs, if we had only ramps and elevators, there will not be any barrier to enter buildings for for anyone. So that's an important thing. Disability, historically, we study also, we also have like a historic, we develop an historic eye in order to understand how to address disability and discrimination in our societies. So, one of the readings has to do with how disability has been used in the past. The medical field and the society in general, consider disability to be a spiritual or moral condition, right? Disability was presented as a defect. It was presented as a shame to the person or their family, right? If someone was born with a disability, it meant that the family, did something wrong. It can be also, it was seen as a taste of faith, right? Having been chosen by God. So if someone has a disability, that's a test for the person, for the family. So those have been explanations of disability. Another explanation is that it's a result of sins, and thus it exposes the family and its sins. It's been very much used in the 19th century with, family, of a person considered alcoholic and a son and a daughter was born, and it was said, that's the result of the sin. So this is a discourse that has been, spread in society, and it has created the kind of discrimination that, or the eye that we have on people with disabilities. So we study how this has been that, impactful, and how this created a problem for how we perceive disability nowadays. Also, it's been used to refer to, a medical and individual condition. For example, disability very much has been seen as a medical problem in the individual. We talk about a defect or a failure of bodily system, or conflicted impairment like Down syndrome. It has been considered to have, more implications, right? Because disability, is seen in this medical individual condition, a question of healthcare habit. And this, this vision of a disability has promulgated the view of disability as a personal tragedy. So this is a context, a historical context that students study in order to understand the problems behind it. Because disability has always been treated as, something to be avoided. And why? We have a few classes on pregnancy and abortion. Why is it that, when a woman is pregnant and there is, prenatal testing that is performed, the first thing that doctors usually convey, if they see that they can be a risk of disability, what is it that they do? They consider abortion, right? So we talk about this debate, and it's a debate that comes often in the New York Times. There was an article on January 1st, 2022, about the problems of prenatal testing, and it has very much to do with capitalism, and it plays a role, it plays a lot on how society views disability. Prenatal testing are a business, according to the New York Times. And so we studied the implications of that and the debates around it, especially like the different views on abortion, the feminist point of view, the disability movement point of view. And so it's a very interesting debate that we have in class. So I wanted to add a few slides on April. I mean, we're in April, and April is Autism Acceptance Month. And I thought it important to talk about it today because last year, the Autism Acceptance Month changed its name. Now it has this new name because before it was Autism Awareness Month. So they decided to change the name last year to focus on inclusion and not cure, right? All that I've presented on disability regarding like the medical model that I will talk a bit more about right now has to do a lot with our view of autism, and we view autism as something that we have to cure, or disability as something that has to be avoided or cured, right? So The month of April was Autism Awareness Month, and it's been changed to acceptance because the idea is to, says Christopher Banks, the president and CEO of the Autism Society of America. He says that awareness is knowing that somebody has autism. Acceptance is when you include a person with autism in your activities, help them to develop in that community and get that sense of connection to other people. So acceptance is a wide variety of things. It focuses on, for example, seeing that people have amazing things to contribute, that everyone is part of humanity, and accepting is the first step to parity in education, healthcare, etc. Right? So they chose to change the name into acceptance to focus on that question of parity. Autism Acceptance Month works against misconceptions regarding autism. Some of them are the following, right? I listened yesterday. I wrote this slide this morning because I listened yesterday to a program on NPR regarding Autism Acceptance Month, and they were focusing on girls and women with autism. And they say that, you know, women are less diagnosed frequently because, there's what happened is that the medical establishment, and that's what they talked about in the program, has a male gaze, right? They talked about how the research on autism has been made on boys and not so much on girls. So it's very difficult to diagnose women and girls of autism because the paradigm is the one of the boy, of the male. So researchers end up with a male-oriented diagnosis. When girls or women go to the doctor for some specific reasons, they are often labeled as depressive and other things, and it's very hard to get to right diagnosis. And sometimes also people say, you know, my daughter is very smart, something's happening with her, but she's so smart, she cannot have autism. So one of the things that Autism Acceptance Month fights against is this misconception. People with autism are smart. They are very smart. And autism has nothing to do with not being smart. So Autism Acceptance Month is about fighting this prejudice among others. And it's very, very important to keep that in mind. In the course, we see many examples of people with autism who have achieved great careers, who are writers, who are, actors. For instance, we have an entire class dedicated to Temple Grandin, who might be the best example of a person with Asperger's syndrome who got a PhD. She's a professor at Colorado State University. She's written books, she does TED Talks, and she's done so many things for research on animals. So that's an example that we study in class. What we do in this class is try to understand how disability is viewed in society and in culture. And we talk specifically about two models. One is the individual model, and the other one is the social model of disability. The individual model of disability puts the accent on the individual. It thinks that the individual has to change, and that has been like the main model applied until the last 20 years. It is reductive. It fails to see the complexity of life. Life is more than the biological, right? The individual model of disability puts the accent on the body of the individual, on biology. And it is medicalized. It's the medical model of disability, and it creates essentialism. Furthermore, it creates trauma on the considered disabled body because these persons are not seen as persons. They're seen as mere body with something that does not work. In addition, it removes the disabled body from social life. For example, we are all aware that people with disabilities were put in asylum institutions. They were the German Nazis created euthanasia. There is a class, we talk about eugenics, a session in this course. We talk about eugenics and eugenics law in the US, in Germany, before World War II, in Europe. So, and we try to understand why these laws were created. We also talk about laws of sterilization. People with disabilities were sterilized because this was seen as a hygienic measure, right? Governments didn't want people with disabilities to reproduce. So we talk about those laws. And we see that until 2020, December 2020, the law of sterilization of people with disability still existed in Spain. So it's been existing until 2020. So 2 years ago, it was a bit more than 2 years ago, they decided to change the law, which is pretty amazing and outrageous. So we talk about that. However, a social model of disability, which we also study, puts the accent on society. It tries to change society, to give voice to disabled and activists instead of the medical profession. So what a social model of disability does is to understand that it is society that creates disability. An individual is not disabled per se. What happens is that society makes an individual disabled because we have the norm, right? We have the example of the stairs is a good one. If we didn't have stairs, there's some sort of disability that wouldn't exist anymore. The same goes with education. We have normatized an education, but not every individual learns the same way. You know, Asperger's syndrome, in the case of Temple Grandin, is a very good one because she learns through images. So she is this extremely brilliant person, but the way she learns is different than the way that the standard of education. So we talk a lot about education as well. Right, so now I go to the normate. What is considered normal? Why do we think according to a normative system? In this class, we talk very much about the norm and about how the norm creates barriers, how the norm excludes people, how the norm doesn't, is not creating an inclusive society. Disability, as I said, has historically been seen as something to be fixed, as a medical condition, but it should be considered a social issue. So that's what we argue in this class. And we also see how it is a cultural identity. Some classes have to do with, specific so-called disability. One of them is deafness. And we see that the deaf disability movement argues for writing deafness with a D, a capital D, because with the capital, that creates an identity. We also talk about sign language and how sign language should be included as, a language that everyone will learn. If we learned how to speak the sign language, then deaf people would not have this disability. So why do we consider someone coming, for instance, from France, like me, not having a disability in the US, if someone else cannot speak French, right? But I'm not considered, someone from France is not considered disabled, but someone who speaks the sign language is considered disabled. Well, they're not disabled. The people who are disabled are the people who do not speak sign language, right? So that's something that we debate, that we talk about, how the norm creates disability in society. So if we consider disability a cultural identity, that would change a lot for our society. It would help redefine accessibility. It would have it would mean having an inclusive society in which everyone communicates. Sign language is a good example. If we consider sign language a language like English, like French, like Spanish, then it is not a disability. It is a language. And in order to communicate with people who speak sign language, then you learn sign language. And then it, helps having everyone participate in an equal manner. It would help redefine normal. then we wouldn't see, someone who doesn't hear as someone who's not normal. We would see someone who speaks sign language as someone having this identity, as anyone from any other country who has, or group who has an identity because thanks to the language they speak. So this class is about disability studies and critical disability studies. So how to be critical about the way we approach disability, the way we approach disability studies as a field. But critical disability studies is not a homogeneous discipline. It intersects with many things, with feminism, with queer theory, with critical race studies, with post-colonial studies, with aging studies. They are part of the field, the disability studies movement that says that at one point we will all become disabled, right? Disability, we all age. So at one point we will be disabled. Critical disability studies rooted in intersectionality. Right here you have the individual and all that, the fields that intersect with the individual. So what does intersectionality mean? It is the interconnected nature of social categorizations such as race, class, and gender as they apply to an individual or a group. So it is when two or more categories intersect with each other, so cross each other, right? So in this case, we'll also say that disability is a categorization that intersects with gender, race, and class. When you had gender and race, they intersect. It's an intersectionality. When you have disability and gender and race, they intersect. It's called intersectionality. So critical disability studies also expands on and to include non-apparent disabilities, right? So there are some disabilities you cannot see, we cannot see: cognitive, intellectual, chronic health, mental health, etc. So we do study those and we do talk about those in the class. Doing critical disability studies offers new perspectives and critiques to models used to study disability. So it uses disability as an analytic, as a tool to look at something specific. Dan Thorpe says that disability studies analyzes how the world engages and interacts with people with impairment, which produces disability. So disability is produced. It's not something that is inherent to the individual, it is produced. Critical disability starts with disability, but never ends with it. It takes both the produced disability and the person with impairment and analyzes the world. And finally, this course, and this is my last slide, we only have one semester to explore these fascinating issues. And there are usually many students register for this course, but we still debate a lot. I like students to participate, so I ask questions and I go around with the microphone. I use a microphone because all classes are recorded. They are accessible every day after class. All classes are on the Blackboard site, so anyone can watch my class when it ends, which is, I think, very important. The course has a subtitle, Disabled Bodies, National Politics. So why is that? It's because the body is at the center of society and politics. We cannot disconnect our body from what happens in society and from politics. So we studied that. And some of the questions that we'll ask in this course next semester, when I teach it again, is why do some bodies matter most than others? Why do we have this norm that creates a hierarchy between bodies? What does it imply for our daily lives, daily interactions, for coexistence with each other? How can we understand the norm better in order to change it? So we are citizens of this world. We want to understand the world. We want to understand the norm. And maybe after that class, after we debate, we are more aware of the necessity to change the norm in order to have a more inclusive society. So that's one of the goals. How can we perceive inequalities better so as to actively build a more just and equal society? These are universal questions, and they can certainly make us think about the notion of disability and society. Thank you so much. I think I will end my presentation here. It's half an hour. If you have questions, please ask.
Thank you so much. So we have some time for questions. If our attendees would like to either use the Q&A or you can use the raise your hand feature. If you'd like, I can unmute you and you can ask a question. We'll give you a few minutes to see if any questions come in. Let me check Q&A. Okay, I don't see any questions.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. Thank you, Professor Violetti, for your thoughtful, informative presentation. We hope everyone has a wonderful rest of their day. And thank you so much.
Thank
Bye,
you for
everybody.
the invitation. It was a pleasure.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.